Testing. Can everybody hear me at the back?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Oh, good evening. I'm off to a good start. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on such a miserable night. As you can see, we're kind of starting the meeting off on a sad note. We lost Don Tebble last week. Short fight bladder cancer. They had a nice little do for them up on the new place on Cotton Road there. Can't think of the do. Just what? Just Stefanos, yes. Just Stefanos. Nice little do for them there. Now, if anyone is interested, they suggest in lieu of flowers donating to the Bladder Cancer Canada. So what we thought we'd do, for anyone that wants to donate on their own, we printed off a few forms here, and any amount over $20, I believe you can get a tax receipt for. Or you can go to www.bladdercancercanada.org and do it online. Or if you're interested in just giving a small donation, you can pop her in the little brown box on the table there, and as a branch we will send in whatever we collect. So you've got three options, well, four. You don't have to do anything. So that, unfortunately, is the opening statement for this evening. Okay. Back there. His card is here too if you want to see it. Okay, this is our agenda for this evening. We have a few announcements, and we'll have our feature presentation. We'll take a little break, and then we'll come back with branch reports and more announcements. And then we'll either have the brick wall bomb, or Dan has offered to give us a little tour of some of the vintage Facebook websites, like Vintage Oshawa, Vintage Whitby. He knows of several of them, so if we want, we can, he's volunteered to give us a little tour. And then, of course, we have our 50-50 draw at the end. First-time attendees. Is there anyone here for the first time? We don't want to center you out, but in case you have relatives here, you can stand up and advertise a few of your relatives that you're searching, just in case you can connect with anyone. Anyone here for the first time? No? Okay, we'll move right along. Thought I fixed that too. Guess not. Okay, there's a couple of OGS webinars coming up. One's on March the 5th, so this week, a little bit later. This one's Hidden Gems in German and Polish Archives and how to find them. So if you have any German ancestry, might be a good one to listen to. You just have to go to the OGS homepage, ogs.on.ca, and there are links that'll take you into it. I believe you have to register for it ahead of time. Anyone that is an OGS member can always listen to it later as well, because it will be put into their archives for later. Also, we won't be meeting before the next one, which is on April the 2nd, so we put this one up as well. This one's how to trace your family history using the Archives of Ontario collection. So if you want to get a good rundown on what's at the archives and how to do genealogy there, there's another excellent one to put on your calendar. And if you're a real glutton for punishment, the 24-hour live marathon is coming up, March 12th and 13th. It starts Thursday, March 12th at 5 p.m. And I don't know if that's Eastern or I'm not sure whether that's Eastern Standard Time or where. We'll have
Can you make
check
a
the
group
website
and take turns watching?
Yeah. Well, luckily, apparently a lot of this will be available afterwards as well for at least a week, I think. So you stay awake as long as you can, sleep through the night, and then wake up in the morning and finish her off, and then the ones you miss, you go.
Steve, is that your image, your illustration of the computer?
No. That's theirs.
Pretty old, that computer.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks like floppy drives, doesn't it?
So, get any webinar on that.
Or the internet.
Yeah.
It's not a lot though.
But,
You got the wrong dates too. Ends Friday, March 12th, starts March 12th.
Yeah, which one
Oh,
is
so it's
March 12th?
Thursday, oh, yeah, yeah.
it's
it's
12 and
Thursday,
13.
Friday.
Oh,
So I think we're safe, but yes,
Friday, March the 13th, yeah.
you're not supposed to catch that.
So if you want to stay in the house on March the 13th.
Anyways, here's some of the speakers. You'll recognize a few of the names, but they're from all over: New Zealand, Israel, Germany, England, Netherlands, North Carolina. I don't see a Canada on there, but
I guess we're not important enough.
we didn't have somebody speaking on whatever subject they wanted, I guess.
There's 24 of them, so you got one for an hour each.
You got one for an hour each, exactly. Yeah, no, that's the whole plan. They're going on through, and there's a little rough idea of some of the topics.
Oh, that's good. So
How DNA influences our identity. Advanced Googling for your grandma. Can a dead man sign a deed? Some New Zealand family history. My Heritage DNA 101. Emigration via Hamburg. So using Dutch parish registers from the 17th and 18th century. Researching a Hessian soldier. Black, yellow, red. Find your Belgian ancestors. A little bit of everything. Coded census, deciphering the U.S. Census. My ancestors were Normans. Oh, really? Prove it. So a variety of everything here for the advanced as well as the beginners. So a little bit of everything. Oh, Swedish is on there. Swedish is on there too. So. And a reminder about Conference 2020. Coming up June 5th to 7th in the Hamilton Convention Center. The motto is finding the past and moving into the future. And the early bird pricing has been extended until March 14th. So if you want in at the cheaper prices, hop to it. And how I got it on there twice, I don't know. It must have messed up on that too. Oh, well. Okay, and now for our featured program. Dr. Amy Barron is the program coordinator at Clarendon Museums and Archives and the faculty at Fleming College. She has a PhD in ancient history and archaeology from the University of Toronto. And her subject tonight, I'm going to give it a try, is Susan Nawigishkoke, Goose, Bolin, and the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations.
So I may technically have been introduced as program coordinator from the Clarendon Museums, which is in Bowmanville, but I'm kind of moving back in time in my own personal life to take you back to Scugog Shores Museum in Port Perry, where I was the curator between more or less between 2010 and 2014 with some sort of weird gaps. But so we're kind of going back in time there, and I know there's at least one member of the crowd here who remembers me well from there. So we're going to be looking at a little bit about the history of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations, which is a very big mouthful, and from now on will just be MSIFN. And I do want to look at one particular woman. It's so rare in the history of the First Nations to know anything about individuals, and while we'll look at the history of the Mississaugas in general, we are very fortunate to have several individuals we do know about because of their interactions with early white settlers and researchers. And in the case of one of these people, even more rare that it happens to be an individual woman. this really started because in 2011 we had a grant to put together a permanent exhibit about the local Indigenous people in the area around Port Perry and Scugog. So what we decided to do at that point was to partner with the Mississaugas and put together a team where we would talk about the ancient parts of the history using archaeology, which is my background, but then we would move right through to the Mississaugas of today. So the process of that was to create an exhibit called Scugog's First Peoples, A Living History. Before you get all excited, I love to show this picture, and I love this exhibit. Sadly, in the years since I've left Scugog, the Heritage Center, which is where this exhibit was set up, has been closed down, reflective of so many changes in history and culture at the moment, sadly, in terms of cost cutting. This exhibit will hopefully, in the future, go up at the Museum Village in some newly designed place that no one's figured out yet. But at the moment, this doesn't actually exist. So I'm just taunting you with something you could have seen but you've missed. It was a really fun exhibit, and it took the whole history. The museum has artifacts that extend all the way back to about 9,000 years old that are archaeologically excavated around Scugog. So we also had a lot of interactives for the kids, and it was basically telling you the breadth of history. So that was kind of where that started. And for us, that's where I started, I guess, to be fair. The museum had already had a long history working with the Mississaugas. So, for instance, almost a decade previous to that, we had set up the Ojibwe Heritage Interpretive Lands, which are out at the Museum Village, working with the Mississaugas to plant indigenous different sorts of plants that we use for ceremonies, for medicine, for food. We also have a wigwam, we have full-scale birch bark canoes, so we could teach children about not just pioneer history, but also about First Nations history in the area.
Is that an all-weather exhibit, or was it?
Well, is it all weather? So it's out in all weather. Whether it should be is another matter. Yeah, basically the furs and all of the artifacts now live in one of our 2 cabins at the Museum Village. The wigwam in the past was always covered up every winter. It isn't always covered up now, and it's certainly showing the rough signs of wear. If we were good Mississaugas, we would recover that wigwam every year. But it's crazy hard anymore to be able to get birch bark in that sort of size and scale. So we reached the point where we tried to cover it every 3 years, and now it probably hasn't been redone in almost a decade. It's just really, really hard to acquire large sheets of birch bark anymore. So it's not looking quite as nice as it is there, but it's not too bad. The other project that they had done, again, shortly before I started, was a project called Transforming Gifts of Mother Earth, where what we did is, I'm going to say his name over and over and over, and there are some connections for you people. Dan Denby is the person who did most of the research, and his wife Sandy Denby is a longtime OGS sort of person, so some of you may know Sandy and Dan. Dan is very much our historian at Scugog on all things First Nations. And Dan had this idea, he wanted to do a project where they were going to recreate all kinds of traditional crafts. And Dan is hardcore, there is no cheating. If you need anything, you go out in the bush and you find it. And he wanted to redo all these things working with a group of young Mississaugas so that they could learn their own traditions as well. So over the course of several summers, working with a bunch of students and with a young Trent University PhD student, they made drums, they made baskets, they tanned all kinds of furs. We had kind of a deal with the roads department where they'd be like, we got a fresh one for you, Dan. We'd go to pick it up. So we have all kinds of cool tan furs. And they actually made.
Any skunk?
No, they have standards. Yeah, we went big on deer. We've got deer. We do have a bear, a small bear cub that got hit by a truck, so that was useful. Not for the bear, obviously, but for us. We like to think of it as recycling. But Dan also made 2 full-scale birch bark canoes. Very, very hardcore, doing it all traditionally, painstakingly, miserable, grumpy, horrible work to do.
Now, is he Native himself?
He does not, and Dan's always a little uncomfortable about this because he goes out and he's teaching these First Nations youth traditional crafts, and yet he's like an old white guy. He's a firefighter. He spent a long time sitting around fire houses reading about First Nations stuff. but he's absolutely dedicated and passionate about it, and the Mississaugas have this long-standing relationship with Dan where they really do trust him, and any kind of working with the First Nations group is all about building that trust over time. So they really do trust Dan, and they have him come and do workshops, or they did. Dan doesn't do as much of this anymore, where he would come and do workshops with their youth. So he is, and in fact, the second of the canoes, Dan despises this one. He said this is not very good. I'm sure any of us could build a birch bark canoe that didn't look that good, right? He's like, that one's not very good. I've been in the lake in that one, it's fine. But he made a second one that's much better, and he gave that to the Mississaugas, and it's on display in their administrative center. He also allowed the small group of Mississauga youth actually painted that one before it was put on display. So they had fun doing lots of this, but it was all of this was this long-standing tradition we had working with the Mississaugas, so we already had really good relationships with them when I got there.
Is there also a relationship with the Canoe Museum in Peterborough?
Well, the Canoe Museum in Peterborough, yeah, all kinds of jealous for all their canoes, right? Anyone's who ever had a chance to play there or in their background, their back storage areas, which is just amazing. We don't have a lot of relationship with them. I said the birch bark canoes we own, we made. So they're not authentic, they are authentically produced, but we made them ourselves. The nice thing about all the stuff that Dan made is it meant that kids could handle it. I use it with school groups and the children could handle it. I could take it into schools. He also, bless his heart, for that exhibit made me a 3-foot birch bark canoe, which is so much easier to take to a school. But he actually stopped speaking to me for several months after he made it because he made it all traditionally, so much harder to make it small scale, right? Things like bending those cedars to make the gunnels with your knee by warming it in the fire and bending it and warming it in the fire and bending it. When it's small, as soon as you start to bend it, it's like, snap! Mm-hmm. There were reeks of apparently snap went on at his house, and I phoned Sandy, and she's like, Dan doesn't want to talk to you right now, you better not phone right now. I'm like, okay, good. But eventually it's lovely, and he's put his name in the plaque in it. So the other part of this that we really wanted, and why it was great working with the Mississaugas, is we had their input as to what they wanted to go into this exhibit. We also worked with 2 of their senior elders, Leona Charles and Harold Ashkaway. And Leona Charles is going to come into our story. But one of the main things we wanted them for was this audio component at the end, which tells 5 stories. And we didn't want it to be our voices telling stories about Chief Jacob Crane and about Susan Bolin, who we're going to get to. We wanted it to be their voices. I get to play the part of Susanna Moody, which is fine, that's fair, you know, whatever, white immigrant, play the part of Susanna Moody. Excellent, but we wanted their voices doing the First Nations ones. They were a little nervous about it, but we did have them do it. The reason we had Harold Ashkaway, who is the male elder of the MSIFN, read Chief Jacob Crane, who is a chief we'll talk about in a little bit. And we had Leona Charles read Susan Bolin's part as the audio in here. I was very thrilled when Leona showed up because she had chosen to do the first part of it and to introduce herself in Ojibwe, which is very much a language that's starting to slip away. Also, why it was great to have Leona do this is Leona is actually the great-great-great-granddaughter of Susan Bolin. So I'm just going to play you the audio clip from here, provided we have managed to make this tech work. So here we go.
Dunjaba. Greetings. Bonjour, Anin. Candas from Qua Nishnakas. Nagig Dodam. Scugog Manising Dunjaba. Greetings. My native spiritual name is Woman Who Knows. My English name is Leona Goose Charles. I am of the Otter Clan. I am a member of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. My great-grandmother was born into a time of sadness. Her Mississauga father had just been drowned shortly before when his canoe had capsized during a violent storm on Stony Lake. Her horrified mother, watching from the shore, had tried to save him. The baby Susan came into the world soon after. By the age of 15, she was an orphan living with the family of Thomas Nogan, brother of the chief of Curve Lake, who camped on Susanna Moody's pioneer farm near Lakefield. When she grew up, she married her first husband, my great-grandfather, George Goose. But sadly for Susan, her husband died around the time that her son, George Jr., was born. So at the age of 26, she was alone again. She later married John Bolin from Curve Lake, who was a nephew of Chief Nogan, and by 1871 was living in Scugog. During her lifetime, she had 3 children, but only George survived her. My grandfather, George Goose, would eventually become the chief of Scugog First Nations.
So, it's just so great when you're doing any kind of thing to actually get that oral history in the voice of the person who actually did it, and that's just, that's fabulous. And in her case, she was starting with a lot of information we'd given her, but I love that she translated it into Ojibwe so that she could read it that way. And the idea of grandmother, she kind of goes grandmother, great-grandmother at different times slightly. It's actually great-great-grandmother, but all grandmothers are grandmothers. So. We'll get back to Susan Bolin and her life in a little bit. First, we're going to do kind of a general timeline. I am an archaeologist, so I always go back to the very beginning because that's what we do. So one of the great things in our exhibit is we had archaeological finds that have been dug up around Lake Scugog. So we do have things that are as old as 9,000 BCE. So those early periods, there's the Paleo period, the Archaic period, the initial woodland, and the terminal woodland. We have lots of archaeological material about that, and I think archaeological stuff is great, but for tonight, we won't start back that far. Otherwise, it'll take us a very long time to get back to Susan. We do have a lot of both groundstone tools and flake stone tools at Scugog. But we're not going back that far. We're going to go to Samuel Champlain. So, of course, Samuel Champlain in 1608 establishes the first sort of settlement, and this is really impact where we're going to start. So, he's a French navigator, explorer, and I'm sure you all know who Champlain is. He made many trips over the Atlantic, settled in, and brought the first people here. We're going to jump ahead ever so slightly. So in 1615, when Champlain did eventually get all the way down here and have a look around in Ontario, what he found was we try and divide the history of, it's very complicated when you're talking about the history of the First Nations people in this area. There's lots of different groups, there's lots of different movement. It's kind of complicated to keep it all on track. So we sort of simplified it into 3 time periods. So 1615, this first map, basically what you have is the Ontario Iroquois, who are the people that Champlain would have seen. So those are the people you're probably used to thinking about, the Huron or the Petun, the Wendat. Those people are coming in, they are living Iroquois in that section. They are mostly agricultural folks. And the Ojibwe are just up and around the edges around them. And then you also have Iroquois down in what we would call New York State. Those are the 5 nations Iroquois. So that was sort of what existed. There's basically 2 groups of speaking peoples that Champlain would have encountered, the Iroquoian speaking peoples and the Algonquian speaking peoples, which would include our Ojibways and Mississaugas. So then by 1649, what's happened is disease has first off taken a big toll on all the First Nations people. And then the 5 nations Iroquois, those folks from south of the border, as we would consider it now, they have basically pushed up and more or less killed off most of the Ontario Iroquoian types. They've either killed them or they've been sort of assimilated into the 5 nations. The Ojibwe are still minding their own business up in the top, being hunter-gatherers. By the end of that century, though, by 1700, the 5 nations again have suffered from warfare amongst each other. They've suffered from disease dealing with early settlers. They've also been pushed back by the Ojibwe. This is one of those ones where you have to kind of go with cultural differences. Historically speaking, we more or less feel like what happened to the First Nations happened to them, the 5 nations of Iroquois, happened because of internal fighting and because of dealing with early people who are coming. The Ojibwe have a very much stronger tradition that they militarily push them out. So.
What about the Cree? Now they're a little further north, are they?
And this way a little bit. Yeah, right here we're dealing with the main groups. Again, Algonquian types involve a lot. So you've got the Chippewas, you've got the Ojibways, Mississaugas, Algonquin groups. But yeah, that's mostly what we're dealing with.
Did the Cree and Ojibwe get along okay?
The Ojibwe are not very militaristic because they're kind of migratory, whereas the Iroquoian folks are more militaristic because they're sedentary. So once you want land, you need to fight for it, which is obviously going to be the problem once we get to the British, right? Whereas people who are migratory and move are less connected to land and consequently usually less military. There's less need to fight. So the kind of vision of what life would have been like is captured in some of these 19th century artists, even though they're looking at a period a little bit later. So we have Paul Kane's Indian encampments on Lake Huron, and we have Francis and Hopkins shooting the rapids. This early life with the French, not by the 1800s when these art were done, but it's giving you a sense of what the 1700s was like. The French are really different because the French They're traders, they're partners, they intermarry with the First Nations quite a lot. It gets very difficult to start tracking your ancestry if you're French and you've been here since the 1700s, right? All of them, they treat the ability that they've been allowed to use the land as a gift of the First Nations, and they give huge gifts in return. They have a very different kind of pattern. They're not taking land to hold it, they're dealing and trading with a trading partner in the same way the First Nations trade with each other. So that all changes because, of course, we get to the late 1700s and two major things happen. One, obviously, Plains of Abraham, General Wolfe, and they're all fighting away, and of course, the British win. Yay for the British. Changes things a lot, though. So now the British control North America. Well, the northern parts of North America, not the States, because at the same time, they're losing that part. So, of course, in the States, we have the loss, and then all these United Empire loyalists. So those things come together nicely for the British in some ways because they desperately need more people up here to hold the land and prove that it's not French. And they have all these people coming up. So the British have a possibility of bringing these people here. Lots and lots of us probably have ancestors who came up as United Empire loyalists. The problem is this is a very different attitude when it comes to dealing with the First Nations because they need land. And while the British in the beginning do accept that they accept Aboriginal ownership of land, they do put in what they call fair policies that they believe are going to deal with fair trading and deals with negotiating for land. They don't actually follow through on much of that. And it's a very different concept for the Ojibwe. They do not have that sense of ownership of land. Which leads, of course, to all kinds of difficulties with those first treaties. So before I get to the Williams Treaty, which is the one that affects the Mississaugas, the first treaty that kind of affects all of us here in Durham region is that a 12-mile stretch all along the water, so 12 miles from the water up, all the way along from basically Trenton to Toronto, so kind of 100 miles, is written up as a treaty with a variety of Mississauga chiefs. And they get all the chiefs to sign it, saying that the British want 12 miles of land all the way along the Lake Ontario waterfront, 12 miles deep. And they get all the chiefs to sign it, but they hadn't actually filled the treaty out first. So the chiefs sign a document that they don't know says what they're giving away, and then later the British fill it in. And even Lord Simcoe at the time realizes this has been done, and he's like, that's not legit. You made them sign something that didn't say anything. But despite that, we still divide up the land and give it to early settlers. So that's all the bit along the waterfront. The Williams Treaty is everything else. So if you go from that 12 miles north all the way up to like Beaverton and places like that, all of Durham region, York region, almost all of Toronto, thousands and thousands of acres of agricultural land, and most of what's the city of Toronto now. All of that is in the Williams Treaty. When the Williams Treaty is written, though, is the 1920s. At the time that they divide up the land, there isn't a treaty at all. There's not a treaty they have faked and not filled in. There's no treaty. They just give that land to all the settlers, and there's no treaty at all. So it's 1923 when there's a whole Aboriginal Claims Commission, and they're like, wow, wait a minute, all of York, Durham, and the GTA was given away without any treaty. So they do the 1923 Williams Treaty, and they decide to give every Ojibwe person in these areas $375. Even in 1923, this land is worth millions and millions of dollars, so $375 a piece wasn't exactly a fair deal. So just recently, in 2018, they finally revisited that, and they've made a deal for $1.1 billion. So the groups that are affected in that are all the groups that are very connected in this area just north of us. So the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations, I've circled them, but there's 7 nations. There's also the Chippewas of Georgina, there's Beausoleil, there's Rama, there's Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha. That's 7, that's the 7. So those 7 Ojibwe-speaking nations are all very close and interconnected. There's a lot of marriage and interconnected between them too. So when you're following family histories, it's very tricky because there's a lot of back and forth, particularly between Curve Lake and the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, because these groups are very closely related to each other. So that's fine. Archaeology is good, but it only gets you so far. The treaties tell you little bits about what's happening in the Mississaugas, but it's not till we really get people on the ground writing English histories that we have something to go on. And the first man who's really a great person to give us information about what's happening with the Mississaugas is the Reverend Peter Jones. And he does a lot of traveling as a missionary. He's a Methodist missionary through this area, visiting with the different groups. Obviously, his intentions are to try and baptize people. Also, the Methodists are very strongly fighting against one of the things that the British brought in that the French really hadn't, was their main trade good became alcohol. So that there was a lot of poverty, loss, and alcoholism spreading through a lot of First Nations groups, and the Methodists were very upset about this process, so they went in to try and help reverse what the early traders had started. So Peter Jones is interesting. His mother is actually Mississauga. She's an Ojibwe woman, and his father is Welsh. So, and he's raised equally in both cultures. His father doesn't just take him off and teach him to be Welsh. He's actually gets a lot of his mother's traditions too. So he actually speaks Ojibwe, which really gives him the ability in early days to go and travel around. So throughout the 1820s, he's traveling through the northern parts of Durham region, around Lake Scugog, and all the way over as far as Peterborough. So he sees a lot, and he records all of this stuff in his journals. His journals, and there's also a whole thing just called the Peter Jones Collection, are at Victoria University, at the University of Toronto. So there's the Peter Jones Collection is fabulous on history of this area at that time, but particularly in the First Nations. So Peter Jones is talking to all these people, and he's getting lots of things, and he's telling us a lot about what's going on at Scugog at a time when, I have to say, having now been down here at the Clarington Museum, while in Clarington, our main historic house is from 1847, in Scugog, we're all living in log cabins in 1847, right? You guys down here are all civilized with beautiful houses by then, and we are bushwhacking up there in Port Perry. 20 minutes is a long way away in the 1820s. So Peter Jones is going up there into the wilds of nowhere, and he's seeing the early foundations before Port Perry is even really a thing. So for instance, in February of 1827, Peter Jones writes that he encounters some Mississaugas encamped near Whitby. He spends 2 days instructing them in religion and sobriety, and though he doesn't say for sure they're from Scugog, every other time in his diary he meets people there later, they're definitely from the Scugog area. In May of 27, he records his pleasure in hearing that the Scugog Mississaugas had disappointed a whiskey trader by dumping 2 barrels of his whiskey into Lake Scugog. This is the kind of stuff he's wanting to see. He's wanting to see them turn the tide against all of the things that have been brought in to trade with them. And by December of that year, thank you. You can hear me croaking, eh?
Yeah.
Just getting over a cold, but I still have that lovely, it's that 1920s husky voice. I should be singing sultry jazz music.
The fish didn't die, eh? Or poured that whiskey in.
Yeah, and a little fire whiskey will do it. Just fix that voice. In December of 1827, he actually meets a group of Scugog Indians, the same ones who dumped the whiskey back in May of that year. And he spent several days with them, and they say that now none of them will smell the smell or taste the taste of firewater, that they've blocked it out. He also meets another chap who's doing the same sort of work at the time, Reverend Richard Scott from the New England Missionary Society. And he is more interested in, he's actually not up there trying to convert people as much as he's trying to better the conditions for the natives in the area. So one of the things he's trying to do is he's looking at building a school and hiring a teacher to educate the First Nations children, to teach them to read and write. So the teacher he hired is Aaron Hurd, and the Hurd land is one of the first bits of land just south of Port Perry, where Prince Albert is now, the little corners of Prince Albert. From the Scugog side of it, reading all this, I know Aaron, the son Aaron who's hired, he's like 15. So, you know, hey, would you like to be a school teacher? Okay. It's better than working on Dad's farm. Anyway, but presumably Aaron could read and write, and that was good enough. There weren't a lot of people on the ground there. Be like, you can read and write, come and teach at school. By April of the next year, he knows that on the Hurd farm they've now built a chapel, and that they have 100 people coming in attendance, Mississaugas, one of whom is a Goose. We don't know what Goose, but potentially a relation of the folks we'll be talking about shortly. He also, at one point in April of the next year, accompanies 2 Indians in a birch bark canoe 12 miles to the north end of Lake Scugog to see some property on an island near a point where some of them wish to settle. This is one of the first times we get discussion of them settling on the island. Currently they live about where Prince Albert and what is now Port Perry is. They don't live over on the island because anybody who's ever been to Port Perry, the island is not as good farmland. Why would you live on the island? There's good farmland around the edges. Later, they don't get a choice, of course. It's interesting. So he's gone with these Mississaugas. He goes up with them as they're trying to look for land, and then he writes in his journal, he laments that the Scugog Indians have no reserve of lands and are consequently wholly dependent on the government or some benevolent society for a grant. Now, instead of government applying to the original proprietors for the soil for land, they, the natives, have to pray to their great father, the king, for a place to lay their bones in. The irony in that is neither Peter Jones or the Mississaugas at the time realized that they still actually own that land. They don't, in fact, shouldn't have to ask for it. So Jones writes all through 1827 to 1828. Eventually the school gets open and he goes and checks out how it's working, and Scott's at this point actually hired a girl to teach because he says that a number of the First Nations women are looking to learn what they refer to as white women's skills, such as knitting and sewing. More and more people are camping on the herd's farm. It's becoming a big settlement. He also talks about eventually baptizing a lot of these people, and it's interesting, some of the names he includes are Goose, Queengish, and Johnson, which are names that will appear all through and still exist on the island today. So even in 1828, all those families are already there. Finally, in January of 1829, he visits the new native school that's being built in Scugog. It's now a proper log cabin type school on the herd property. There are 150 Mississaugas living in the area in wigwams. And he meets Chief Jacob Crane, who makes a big speech thanking Jones for all his work. That's the last record that he ever visited with the Scugog's island. Well, they're not Scugog Island yet, but the recipients, the natives who live around Scugog. Chief Jacob Crane, it's interesting that he mentions him though in 1828, because this is around the time when we think, from tracking lots and lots of things from different records, we think the Mississaugas went on what you might want to call a kind of a walkabout, that they actually left Scugog to try and find a better homeland. And this isn't clear in any of the records that they have, but it comes up in lots of bits and pieces of records left from other people. So, tracking Chief Jacob Crane and his search from the homeland, the first track we have is in 1930. Peter Jones meets a person who used to be a teacher at that school that he had seen, but now she's teaching in the Bay of Quinte because she says that she formerly labored among the Scugog Indians for some time until they were moved from that place to Lake Simcoe and Mud Lake. So he's surprised. He has just left 2 years before a thriving community living there around the herd property, and now they've all gone away. So why does that happen? Several things happened in 1930. The biggest one affected, in fact, all the settlers around Lake Scugog, not just the First Nations ones. The folks up in Lindsay decided to build a dam on Scugog River, which meant that Scugog Lake flooded. It was never really a lake. It's still only just questionably a lake.
So this was 1830.
1830, sorry. Yes, I keep saying 19. Abandoned 19. There will be no 19s in this discussion. 1830. In 1830, the folks at Lindsay build a dam. They flood all of Lake Scugog to the point where it actually is a lake, which it really wasn't before. It was just sort of swampland. And they actually cover up huge amounts of land. All of the settlers, the white settlers who moved up there, had picked land around the lake, surprise, surprise, and now the lands they've picked are underwater. The First Nations also live around the north edge of the lake. Their lands are now underwater. The First Nations felt that this was just too much. It was a sign of too many settlers there, and it would appear that Chief Jacob Crane decides to take his people someplace else. The white settlers are not prepared for that. They march up to Lindsay in a crowd, and they destroy the dam at Lindsay, and then they march back down, and the people at Lindsay build their dam again. Those were the days. You could just build a dam and flood hundreds of people's property and go, well, I don't know, not my problem.
Well,
The dam stayed and everybody else got different land.
yeah, so the water line today is that high line.
The water line today is, it's the high line. So That's another reason we can't find some of the archaeological material we'd like from those early periods, because it's in the lake, because the lake is flooded a lot. You can get, we have maps at Scugog Shores Museum that shows the original lines of the land people were given, and then the line of the lake now. It's like, yeah, you're underwater, you're underwater, you're underwater.
Would that include graves?
Yes, probably it does. As an interesting fact, the one of the things that Peter Jones talks about is having seen a funeral happen, and we do believe that that same land next to the Herd's land in Prince Albert is where there's been some work done by the Lake Scugog Historical Society suggesting that there is in fact a First Nations cemetery right there at the Four Corners in Prince Albert, which would have been just along the edge of the Herd's property. So it makes sense if there's that huge settlement there, that there would have been a cemetery there too. So they have to find a new home. So a couple of things happen. We have a few records to go on this. In March of 1833, Peter Jones, who is now up at Mud Lake is what they called Kirk Lake back then, he has records that he says that he performed baptisms, and two of the children he baptized in 1833 are Mary and James, the children of Jacob Crane, the chief who he had previously met at Scugog, and Jacob's wife, Morningstar. And Mary is listed in the baptismal records as having been born at Scugog, whereas James is listed as having been born at Mud Lake. So presumably in the last 3 years, they have made some sort of move, and now they're up at Mud Lake, which is Kirk Lake. The other record we have is there's an Indian Affairs record that states in 1936 that a band from Chemong, which again is also Kirk Lake, moved to Balsam Lake under the leadership of Jay Crane, and several years later they moved to Scugog because the soil around Balsam Lake is horrible too. The one other record we have is in a book written in 1847, which refers to 90 Balsam Lake Indians purchasing land at Scugog in 1843. So it does seem that in a search for better land, the one other thing that happens around this time is there is a couple of government sort of pushes to set up some more reserves. One of them is right up near Aurelia, so we believe that's maybe where Jacob Crane took his people first to try and see that reserve. And then there's the one at Balsam Lake. They eventually end up at Curve Lake with their very close relations they've always had with Curve Lake. But none of these places, there's no place like home, right? All of these places are being set up with reserves are on pieces that are terrible, terrible land, terrible farming land, which is why they're being chosen as reserves. So after having spent quite a bit of time, it's probably 14 or 15 years, trying to settle on these different places, they come to a conclusion, which is that they're going to go back. They're going to go back to Scugog. They know they can't get the land they used to have around the lake because the white settlers have continued to settle, and there's been this whole skirmish over the land. So instead, they decide to go and buy themselves, with their own money, 800 acres on the end of Lake Scugog, Scugog Island. So not only is it 800 acres of only questionable farmable land, they buy land that doesn't give them any water rights because that's what's available. All along the water has already been taken by settlers. So they have to pay for the land themselves, so it's not like most other reserves, so it's treated like a reserve because they actually bought the land themselves in 1843. So Peter Jones helps us a lot with that, about getting a sense of what's happening, and we know that it seems to be that they have settled back and this is their new home. The person who's even more helpful as an outside voice about telling us what life was like in this sort of next stage as the land's becoming more settled is Alexander Chamberlain. So Alexander Chamberlain is writing a thesis, the title of which is the rather long Language of the Mississauga Indian of Scugog, a contribution to the linguistics of the Algonquian tribes of Canada. People who write theses, the rule is to come up with the longest title you can. Trust me, I've been there. So once you have your really long title and you have your plan, what Alexander Chamberlain did is he went and traveled around and tried to speak to people who could tell him. He was trying to find what words meant, what names meant. He was trying to record all this because even in 1888, he thought the Ojibwe language was probably dying. One of the things he notes is that Chief Crane is chief and had moved to Scugog Island in 1844 is what he is told, and then Crane died 27 years before he's come is what he was told, so we believe that Crane probably died about 1861. But they still have the story when he gets there of there's being this sort of vague traveling, and then the chief brought us home is kind of the story that he's told. So he's learning various words and names. One of the things he himself is given, he makes quite a good impression on the folks at Scugog Island. He doesn't speak Ojibwe though, so unlike Peter Jones, who could travel fluidly and easily, he doesn't speak any Ojibwe. So he needs an Ojibwe person who speaks good English. And he finds that in one of the Scugog elders. So he spends a lot of time in Scugog because he finds someone who is an excellent speaker of English. She actually speaks English, French, and Ojibwe. And she actually kindly puts on him a name that means the sun bringing the day, and she gives this name to him. It's the name of a past distinguished chief, and she wants the name to live on. So obviously she has a pretty good relationship with Alexander Chamberlain. Oh, and I was going to take that out because the surprise is there, right? Susan Bolin. It's Susan Bolin who tells him this. So now you know. Gosh darn it. She also helps with a lot of other things. She actually helps him with, he's interested in archaeology. He's going around collecting stuff. Again, these are the days, I know as archaeologists, if you were a Middle Eastern archaeologist in the 1800s, you went off to Greece or the Middle East and you happily brought stuff back to London and Paris, right? Same thing, he's trotting around, gathering up archaeological artifacts from the peoples they belong to, and he's bringing them to Toronto, and they're now in the ROM and in the University of Toronto. Interesting that he doesn't really talk about how Susan feels about this. She helps. She takes him to visit local farmers, and the local farmers give him stuff they find in the fields. At one point she tells him a story, and she takes him to show a place where 20 years before someone had dug up a grave right near her house. And she explains she understands it's a grave of her peoples, and she saw archaeologists dig it up and take the stuff away. But it's interesting that Chamberlain never mentions how she felt about that, which I would have been really interested to know, but he doesn't mention that. She also tells him this story that's sort of kind of an origin story as to why they're at Scugog Island. So the origin story, kind of for the roots of them, her story says that more than 100 years before Chamberlain's 1888 visit, two brothers-in-law named Nika and Gwinjik came to the Scugog River looking for game, and finding it was plentiful on Scugog Island, they decided to settle there with their families. And some of their descendants are still there today. So this is the story she tells. A lot of the stories, even now when you talk to the Mississaugas, are all about, those family name traditions are very, very important. And it's not a surprise to me that the two brothers in this story happen to be named Nika and Gwinjik, because Nika is the word for goose. And the Goose family is still very, very, very common, and certainly one of the main families on the island. And the other name doesn't really translate so well, but it's very close as far as an English pronunciation to Queequish, of which there are lots of people still named on the island. And it's just a different pronunciation. I know, neither of those sounded easy, but they're different, and the second one is slightly easier. So, this is told to him by Susan Bolin, who says her grandfather had originally told her that story. Chamberlain really, really likes Susan. He describes her as the wisest of the Indians in the matter of the history of her people and their, gosh darn it, that's beliefs, looks like I'm illiterate, in the past. It's great because Susan can tell him these stories. At this point, she's already in her 60s, so to have an articulate, well-spoken, clearly speaks English person for him to deal with as an elder really helps him. But it gives us an insight into Susan's story at the end of her life. We want to find out about the beginning of her life. How did Susan get to be the person she is living in Scugog Island? So interestingly, Susan's life is also captured by other people. And it was putting all these pieces together where Dan Denby had this whole wonderful epiphany, and he was so excited when he came and told me, because he finally found that he could track Susan in a lot of places. Most amazingly, she is written about in Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush, because our young Susan Bolin, as a young girl, lived on Susanna Moody's property. So this is Susanna Moody here with her family, and a picture when she's a little bit younger. Susanna Moody and her family traveled here in 1832. You're all probably familiar with Susanna Moody and Catherine Parr Trail. I kind of like reading Susanna Moody stuff because she is like not impressed to be here. I can imagine how she feels, right? 1832, I'm a, middle class British woman dressed like that. And somebody's like, hey, let's go to Canada. And I was like, well, okay, dear, if that's really what you want. And then you get here, and I can't even imagine. They go north of Peterborough, up near Lakefield, and they live in a one-room cabin in the bush, dressed like that. And it's funny because she so clings, particularly in the first part of the book, she so clings to her traditions. She's brought a servant, because of course you would, right? And her servant is Irish, and it's really funny that she won't let her servant eat at the table with her. They live in a one-room building together. But her Irish maid can't eat at the same table with her. Interestingly, Susanna has a very different attitude about the First Nations. She really thrives on this whole kind of noble savage concept. The way she writes about them is so 19th century white people, but it's really interesting because she will let the First Nations people who visit her dine at the table with her, but she won't let her Irish servant. She likes the First Nations. She encourages them to camp on her land because she likes them better than her neighbors who are low-class peasants and don't appreciate that she is a higher-class lady. She's still just middle class, but she is holding on to that for all it's worth, living on a log cabin in the bush. Anyway, very different if you read Catherine Partrail, who I think really welcomes the adventure. It's a very different thing. The reason that Susan and her husband, Susanna Moody and her husband, settled near Lakefield is her brother surveyed that land and is already living there, and Catherine Partrail, her sister, is also already living there. So that's why she gets there. They're only there for about a decade. I'm sure there was only so long before she laid her foot down and went, oh no, we're not. And then they moved into Belleville, and she wrote later books where she refers to Belleville as the clearings versus Lakefield, which is the bush. It's better in the clearings. So, but it's interesting because she talks about these First Nations people encamping on her land. She talks about, like I said, inviting them to dine for dinner. She's very, very fascinated by them, very interested in them. And interestingly, this is from her book. Again, you'll hear the way she talks about them, which is a little interesting. But it was midwinter. The Indians had pitched their tent or wigwam as usual in our swamp. All the males were absent on a hunting expedition up the country and had left 2 women behind to take care of the camp and its contents. Mrs. Tom Nogan and her children, and Susan Moore, a young girl of 15. The orphan Indian girl generally kept aloof from the rest and seemed so lonely and companionless that she soon attracted my attention and sympathy, and a hearty feeling of goodwill sprang up between us. This is where she just gets so Susanna. Her features were small and regular, her face oval, and her large, dark, loving eyes were full of tenderness and sensibility, but as bright and shy as those of the deer. A rich vermilion glow burnt upon her olive cheeks and lips and set off the dazzling whiteness of her even and pearly teeth. She was small of stature, with delicate little hands and feet, and her figure was elastic and graceful. She was a beautiful child of nature, and her Indian name signified the voice of angry waters. So, that's Susanna Moody on the young Susan Moore. So what's important is Susan Moore is described as an orphan living with the family of Tom Nogan. Tom Nogan's brother is chief of Curve Lake at the time, actually from the 1830s to 1860s. His brother is chief, so he's the brother of the chief, and he has taken in this young girl. From other records, we know that in her youth, Susan Goose Bolin refers to being raised by the family of the Nogans, and she also refers to living on the land of the white person up near Lakefield. There are other few sideways references that do start to make it seem very likely that she is the same Susan as this Susan. She's raised by the Nogan family and marries into that family eventually on her second husband. So this is also an explanation about why very early on she's probably exposed to English and learning to English from somebody who is clearly her friend, even if otherwise unhappy about living in the bush.
What's curious to me is that there can be an orphan in Indian culture.
Well, and again, orphan, of course, is Susanna Moody's word. But the Nogans are clearly taking her in as part of the family. But she does again talk about that feeling of her being kind of separate. And she is orphaned, and that is a very tragic tale. So, in fact, she loses her father before she's even born, which is, really unfortunate. Her poor mother, pregnant, is on the shores of Stony Lake during a storm, and her father is coming in across the lake, and during the weather's getting worse, and as he's coming in across the lake, his canoe overturns. Susan's poor mother is pregnant and on the shore. She tries to go out and help him, but in her pregnant state, she just can't really swim out to save him, and so he drowns in front of her. And so by the time Susan is born, her father has already passed. Clearly, at some point between that point and when she's with Susanna Moody's form, her mother must have passed away as well. So she's born 1823, 1825 by our records, basically counting back from other things she talks about later in her life. So she is now by around 1838 then, at the age of 15, living on Susanna Moody's property with the Nogan family of Curve Lake. Around 1848, she marries somebody whose last name is Goose. We don't know his first name, but she becomes Susan Goose and is referred to in records that way. And this one's a little bit iffy. In some records, it looks like her son is born in 1859. In other records, he's born in 1849. So it's a little unclear whether he's born immediately after she's married or whether he's born a little bit later, which would question what happened in the meantime, but she might have had stillbirths or kids who didn't survive. Her son is named George Goose, and her husband dies around the same time as her son is born. So again, that might be that he died almost right away in 1849 or in 1859. We do know that shortly afterwards she marries John Bolin. And this goes back to the families protecting themselves and nobody being left alone. John Bolin is also a nephew of the Nogan family, so somebody she probably would have known quite well. And all of these people are Curve Lake First Nations, though probably her Goose husband is not. Goose is a much more Scugog name. After she marries John Bolin, she has a daughter, Agnes Bolin. And we know in the 1871 census, she's living happily, her, John, and the two children. 1888, by that time we know she's in Scugog because we have Alex Chamberlain's writing meeting her. And in the 1891 census, she is still living on a farm on Scugog Island. John Bolin himself lives right to 1899 and is buried on Scugog Island. And Susan herself dies in 1903, and we don't know where she's buried, which is highly frustrating. John Bolin's interesting. So many people on the island assumed that with a name like Bolin, he wasn't one of the names that they knew. They thought that he was an outsider. They thought he was probably a white settler. And so it wasn't until this sort of coming out that they realized that he is some relation to the Nogans and was in fact a First Nations person himself. So Susan obviously lives right to 1903, which puts her at a ripe old age. And the museum thinks we have one picture of her, which is this really terrible image here, and it isn't any better in real life because somebody kept the picture folded in quarters, and the quarter runs right through the old lady's face. That we think is Susan Bolin. So where you see that big X in the middle of the picture might be Susan Bolin's face. This came from the Goose family, and the other people in the picture are some of Goose descendants, and she's the appropriate age in the picture that she would have been, you know, the elder that they are all framing their picture around. It could certainly have been Susan Bolin. As I said, so Chamberlain is some of our best example of what happened with Susan Bolin, and she did assist him with lots and lots of different things.
Do we have an 1851 or 61 census?
Yes, we do. I didn't put 1861 in because I don't have 1851, but the 1861, she's not living here yet, so I just kind of left that one out. At that point, she's still living up near Peterborough. She hasn't moved yet, so the move must have come someplace slightly after Agnes is born, but she's living up, just the other side of Peterborough.
Okay.
And again, that's presumably because John Bolin is Nogan and they are Curve Lake based, not closer. So Alexander Chamberlain, one other quote from him, what he says about Susan Bolin, when he first gets to the Mississaugas, he says, who do you have that knows a lot about your history and who could speak to me? And what he has said is they immediately take him to Susan Bolin. As I said, was Susan Goose originally, but now she's Susan Bolin at this point. Though in some records she's still written down as Susan Goose Bolin. Obviously it's Scugog. They're very interested in maintaining that Goose connection because to them that's the connection to them. He describes her as having the reputation of being the most intelligent woman in the tribe. She provided the most valuable information, consisting of lists of words, songs, legends, folklore, and notes of the history, habits, etc. of her people. Her memory was very good, and her knowledge of the history of her people was considerable. She spoke English, French, and her mother tongue, and could read, but not write. So we know that her first child is still a Goose, George Goose. George Goose does go on to become a chief of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations, which is why that Goose connection is very important to the Mississaugas in Scugog. Interestingly, he marries Charlotte Quinquish, which again is kind of interesting because there you have your Goose and your Nika and your Quinquish coming together again, just like in the original story. And again, that is perpetuated quite a lot in stories on the island. There's a lot of marriage between those two family names. They produce a ridiculous quantity of children, George Goose, so that Susan Goose Bolin ends up with an awful lot of descendants, and why there are a lot of gooses. It's probably one of the most common names on the island today. One of his younger daughters is Ina Goose, and Ina Goose's granddaughter, or potentially great-granddaughter, it always gets a little confusing when we're talking sometimes about how many generations they're counting, is Leona Charles, who you heard at the beginning. She is now the female MSIFN elder and helped with the creation of the exhibit, so that voice you heard. And she was excited to be part of that and to tell the story of her great-great-great-grandmother, which had mostly been lost. They didn't have all these different pieces. She could tell me about Ina, who actually lived to be quite old. She was there when the museum first opened. She was actually there for the museum's opening day in the 70s, and was at that point considered one of the last great basket makers of the MSIFN. So that tradition was still there. So I just want to finish with the last thing that we had in the exhibit when we were putting it together. Is we worked a lot with the Goose clan doing this because they were very much involved and they're very much spokespeople for the MSIFN. They're on the council. So we wanted them to have some sort of message to wrap the exhibit up, and I think it's nice because it's kind of the message of the OGS. And their message was yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which is the idea that they didn't want to think that when we're studying people in the past, we're studying people of the past. We're studying people whose bloodlines still run through today and will move on into the future. And that's what they felt they didn't like when they went to First Nations exhibits, and it was like exhibits on ancient Greeks or something. It's like, hey, hello, we're still here. We live over there on the island, like a block from you. So, so that was kind of the message they took to that. When we opened this exhibit, they had a little surprise for me. So Leona is actually the woman in the blue shirt at the very back. She's slightly hidden. Next to her in the black skirt with the blue shirt with the black sweater is her daughter Della Charles, who is the next Goose generation. When we opened the exhibit, they kept skulking around, and they were doing drumming for me. They're part of the drumming circle, and I was like, do you want to do your next drum song yet? And they're like, no. I was like, what? Because of course, in my mind, I have a schedule. We're doing all these opening things, and the MP's coming, the MPP's coming. They'd done one song, and then they just left the stage, and I have clearly, you were doing 2 songs. And I was like, so we're across the room miming. I'm like, I was like, okay, I'm clearly missing something here. They were waiting because they put together something special for the MP, and the MP was late, and they were not doing song number 2 until the MP arrived because they had done it for him. And so they were waiting. So it was this whole weird thing. So I had to go up and tap dance on stage for a few minutes and be like, so, things to talk about today. The other nice thing that happened during this ceremony, before I play what it was they were waiting for the MP to do, is that Dan Denby, who had done all this footwork, I'm telling you this, Dan did all this research, bless him. They did a ceremony and gave him an eagle feather, making him part of the tribe, the band.
What year was that?
This is going to be November of 2011 when the exhibit opened, and then it was up until 2018 when they closed the Heritage Center. So, and as I said, it has been packed up, and I hope it's going to be put out at the Museum Village at some time in the future, because it's been a great partnership. So I will play you what they were going to play, or what they did in fact play, once the MP finally got here. To do that, I'll plug this.
That's God Save the Queen.
Pretty sure they don't play that one. But nice to see that the descendants of Jacob Crane
sorry.
and Jacob Crane, yeah. They just had that whole thing of House and Commons about how they weren't going to do that. Oh, Canada's okay. Nice to see the descendants of Jacob Crane and Susan Bolin are still part of Scugog today. And there we go. These are just all the people who paid for the exhibit, which we appreciate in the museum world because we have no money. So, excellent. Thank you very much.
Other questions?
Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a lot of family up in that general area, the Wilsons, McClintocks, a lot of names there. My Wilsons settled in, if you know where the Bray farm?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Wilson Farm.
Yeah.
So Prince Albert's not too far. I have a lot of people buried in Prince Albert.
Congrove Cemetery,
Now, you
yeah.
mentioned the native cemetery there. Is it a coincidence that it's not too far away, or?
Well, I'm not sure.
Is there any First Nations in the?
No, there are no First Nations in Prince Albert Cemetery itself, Pine Grove Cemetery.
Yes.
There are African Americans, but they're unmarked and they're sort of off the edge of the cemetery. It's not entirely coincidence in a roundabout kind of way. The reason the cemetery's there is the same reason that the First Nations were there, is the Hurd family. They were one of the really early settlers in that area, and that was their land. They owned all that land that's sort of Prince Albert today. So in the same way that the Hurds were encouraging the First Nations to encamp on their land, they were allowing the missionaries to build schools for the First Nations on their land. They were a sort of a hub of community there. They also donated the land for the cemetery. So the first bit of the cemetery land, the most southernmost part of the cemetery, was Hurd land, and he donated that. And one of the very first burials there is his wife and his daughter.
Yeah, I've got family Leonards and that.
Oh, yeah.
Ewers.
Yeah, absolutely, right. It's a fabulous cemetery. The Historical Society used to do walking tours of the cemetery, and then a couple years we did them with a theater group, and they would act out little scenes in the cemetery, which was fun. I think the Historical Society will do some more tours this year.
And, it's unmarked, but the street going north-south in the cemetery, going by the place called Matthew Street. Do you know how it got that name?
I don't know what it was named after.
No, because actually it's my mom's family from there, but my grandfather Bell, who was named Matthew Bell, is
Yeah.
one of their, buried there in 1919 or something like that. So very early, but it's sort of interesting, Matthew and
Yeah,
Matthew.
what that might
I
be.
presume it's before, but I was curious how.
Yeah, and I guess all those streets around the cemetery went in pretty early, because again, that was, the Crandalls were obviously there right at the very beginning, and the Hurds were the two earliest sorts of families settling there, though the Crandalls then moved into Port Perry and took over. But, yeah, there aren't any Matthew Hurds, so it's certainly named after them. They tended to go for A's, Abner and Alan.
How do you spell Hurd?
H-U-R-D.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not H-E-A-R-D?
No, H-U-R-D.
H-I-R.
Yeah. Well, it was not to say in the past you couldn't just spell your name any way you want, because we all know how frustrating that is.
Right.
But yeah, H-U-R-D, and like I said, the very south chain link fence of the
Yeah.
cemetery, there are several Hurd right along that very edge. So that's kind of where the cemetery started, and then it grew north from there.
Yeah.
And those are some of the early ones.
Now, I know, are you familiar with the Petworth immigration? And anyways, a book was done, and it has a bunch of family letters.
Yeah.
It's Wilson family letters.
Yeah.
And there's a letter from England back here, and it mentions, have you had any more interactions with the Indians?
Yeah.
Was there a lot of interaction? Like my Wilsons come up, all the family come up pretty early, like
Yeah.
1920s, 30s.
That's a really good question. We are so grateful to Peter Jones for basically babbling on month after month after month in his journals, because there's not a lot of early writing. Most of the early settlers don't talk about their interactions with the First Nations. They will sometimes make general comments like, it's really not until you get into, strangely, the 1920s and 30s where people talk about trading with First Nations for baskets. It's that trading between the locals and the cottagers, right, for baskets and things like that. But in the earliest period, they don't make much reference to it. which is interesting.
Are the Jones writings available, easily, or is it only in archives? They're not published or online anywhere?
They're in the archives at U of T. They're easily accessible if you go to there, but you have to go there. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, some of it's in Robarts, some of it's at Victoria College though, in their actual library. So yeah, it's literally called the Peter Jones Collection. So it's there. Yeah.
Have you been involved recently with the people of the Mississauga Nation?
So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wondered how they're reacting to us now that
Truth and Reconciliation and all that.
the Truth and Reconciliation. We belong to, my husband and I belong to a group at St. Paul's
in Bowmanville.
in Bolin.
We call it
Literally
an
just around the
indigenous-
corner from the museum.
We call it an indigenous circle.
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody else is interested in learning more about indigenous stuff, where anybody's welcome.
Yeah.
Last fall, we sponsored an Indigenous weekend. We called it Indigenous Discovery, which we realized was a bad name. You may know why, because there is this doctrine of discovery that was dreamt up back in the 1400s when the Pope and the King of Portugal got together and decided that all these new lands that were being discovered, if they weren't Christian, it was okay to go in and kill them off and take whatever they had. And that was their sort of what they call their doctrine. So this year we're going to call it Indigenous Awareness Day.
That's a much better choice. Yeah, discovery is always mixed with that, like, discovery is such a word that Westerners, and again, we use this in archaeology all the time. It's like, haha, they went down, they discovered Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu was huge. The locals knew it was there, right? Like, wow, we found it. No, we all knew it was there. So yeah, it's always that kind of nervous word to be used.
Yeah, and someone in our group has been in touch with the cultural director, I think his title is, at Scugog.
David Matthews.
Matthew Stevens.
Matthew, oh, yeah.
Yeah,
So
and that's
like
been
David's
kind
not
of
right.
put off. We were to go to meet with him. And right about the time we were to meet with him, the last minute, the day before, he canceled again. He changed the dates 2 or 3 times. And then his supervisor told him, no, he's too busy. And we kind of have the idea that maybe it had something to do with what was going on, or maybe he just is a busy man.
So time is different when you deal with the First Nations. So, yeah,
So that-
scheduling meetings and stuff doesn't really happen like
No,
that.
We
Yeah.
found that last year.
Yeah.
He came to speak on a weekend, and it was excellent, because
Yeah.
most people are not exposed.
He's very good on the treaties.
Very, very
Yes, yes. Well, the treaties, they're very, the MSIFN very much were a leader of the 7 Nations, and when they were discussing the reevaluation of the Williams Treaty, largely because our current chief in Scugog, Kelly Araka, is a lawyer. That's her background. So our previous chief, when I was doing this, Kelly wasn't chief, she was on the band council, but I think she was put into that chief position as they knew they were going to be approaching this whole Williams thing. They needed somebody who really understood the law, and she had been on band council for quite some time. So yeah, I would say it's not so much how everyone is, it's very different group to group. Curve Lake First Nations are very, very different in their interactions. They have interpretive centers, they have whole groups of people who will come out and visit with you. They've always been much more about trying to reach out. They run the petroglyph site, right? They are the erstwhile owners basically of the petroglyph site and help facilitate that site. So they're much more about the teaching themselves, and they're young, but also teaching all of us. Mississaugas and Scugog Island First Nations have never really been that way until they just recently got that kind of program coordinator outreach kind of role. They never had someone who did that. It used to be that if you contacted them, they've said, phone the museum, they've got some good people over there, which always seemed a little weird to us. But so now in the last few years, as they have gotten more and more people reaching out to them, that's why they put that role in, which I think is great. And they've been great on partnering with lots of museums. Oshawa Museum, of course, has just put in a really good First Nations gallery that went into the museum
I guess it opened last year. It's time kind of whirls by. I would say last year, but I could mean 2 years ago or 18 months in that way in which time gets away from you. But really good thing that they partnered with the same gentleman to be sort of the spokesperson for First Nations to talk about it. So yeah, I don't think it is. I think it's just time and meetings, and it all is a much more fluid concept. And that's where working on something like this was tricky. It took much longer than we would have done it because we wanted to work with them, but that meant a lot of fluidity. And one of those things involved the Williams Treaty, because we had written a timeline document that was our version of how we thought the history went, and it was not, in fact, what they had traditionally said themselves. There was this disconnect because they were using their traditional history as explaining their legal position with the Williams Treaty. We had done this researched history, and they kept saying, it's not that we don't believe you, we believe you've probably done better research than us, and Dan is probably right. But we don't want to upset the apple cart. So basically they had our timeline document and they wouldn't move on it until the Williams Treaty proceedings got further. So I was terrified that I'd eventually get this document back, just covered with lawyer speak and all scribbled over. And I finally got the document back, and they literally changed 2 words, and they were adjectives. They weren't even like, I was like, you want the word huge instead of the word big? How many lawyers did it take to decide that? But anyway, so sometimes what I thought was going to be this huge issue, and it was all about legal proceedings, I think was just, it was taking its good old sweet time, working its way through people. There are very few people at the MSIFN anymore. There are very few actual tribe members who are officially part of the band, and many of them are spread out across Canada. So with what we were doing, they actually took our timeline document and all my exhibit panels, I gave them to them for approval, and they literally mailed them across the country to anybody who was still a registered member of the band, so that anybody could have feedback. And in the end, there was no feedback. Whatever, but it was the process that was important for us. We wanted to make sure that when we put it up, they were happy with what we had put up. And Kelly was there that day. Heartfelt thank you, Kelly LaRocca. There she is. I hadn't even thought about that. As I said, she wasn't chief then, but she was very moved at our opening. We did a special private opening just for them to make sure it's the last chance for me to be like, have I done anything wrong? And that was a really nice event and a lot of fun. And then we did the public opening afterwards. So
Yes, the sensitivity is a big thing.
sensitivity is a big thing, right? For sure.
It was our understanding that our government has done a lousy job of honoring most treaties, including the Williams Treaty. That the original Williams Treaty named a sum of money that was to be paid. It never was paid.
And it was peanuts.
It was peanuts, but even that was never honored by the Canadian government. It's really a sad story. We've spent a lot of time talking about the residential schools, which isn't all bad. There was some good, but by and large it was.
I can't remember who's doing. There's a really good traveling exhibit on residential schools right now. It was at the Peterborough Museum like 6 months ago. I'm not sure where it is now, but it's really, really interesting and has lots of voices, including people who, yes, didn't have a terrible time and were educated, but of course lots of stories that are. I think it's really good because it shows all stories. It's got lots of different stories. Stories from people who were teachers, stories from students, stories from people who had absolutely horrific things happen to them, stories from people who actually felt they learned a lot of stuff. So, you know, lots of things. But I guess all of this is about discussion. What I like to see is, I have smallish children. They're not that smallish anymore. They're 12 and 14. They're actually terrifyingly not small. What the kids in the schools know about and talk about and their understanding of all these things, certainly stuff that I certainly was never taught in schools, and I'm sure none of you guys were taught in schools, right? It's a very, very different system now. And so I think each generation moving forward be so much better educated about all of these things that, and change comes slowly, right? And just making sure that the next generation is more aware of what happened. And truth and reconciliation is the first step of that. And it will just be a slow process, right? As people get used to that. But it's about discussing, and it's what you said about sensitivity, right? It's the little things. I just want to put an exhibit about First Nations. So it's important to partner with them to do that. And if that means it takes longer, whatever. I want them to be happy with the final result, and they were, so that was good. But there's all kinds of tiny details you wouldn't even have thought of that you're just like, oh, wow,
that seems really obvious when you say it, but I just didn't even think of it, except that I have their elders sitting right there looking at me going, is the light bulb going to go on over Amy's head? You could literally see conversations like that. An example, at one point I had 4 banners, and I wanted each banner to have a different colored stripe at the top. This is just a design thing to me, right? And I was like, so I just need 4 colors. It'd be great if each banner had a different color at the top, and there'd be 4 colors, and they'd all be different. And they're looking at me like, is the light bulb going to go on? And I was like, I don't know what 4 colors I should pick, green, and then they were kind of like, and then finally one of them was wearing one of those medicine wheel circle buttons, and they're like, I was like, oh, I know what the colors should be. They should be red, yellow, or black and white. They're like, yes, they should. I'm like, okay, that was good. That was a good one. But yeah, that was just a silly little thing. Would they have cared if I made the colors purple? No. But when I want 4 colors, it's kind of an obvious choice. So it's little things like that. Sometimes it's not the big things, it's the little things that you just wouldn't even think of unless you're partnering with them. So excellent. Oh, another question. Yeah. Someone who knows Scugog well.
Yes, growing up there, you know a lot of history about, well, the history of the island. And I'm really pleased to know that Leona can trace back to Jacob Crane, and that Kelly can trace back her Edgar people and that. But some of the other families who really are disappearing from there, are their families being traced? I mean, we are genealogists here. Are there families, have they done that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, it sort of came up in the exhibit. There was a bit of a comment once we finally got to the opening from a few other families that felt that the Gooses, for instance, were too well represented. So there's a little bit of that, right? Because there are a lot of them, and because we put a call out to the community saying, would everybody like to send us pictures that we can incorporate into the exhibit? That call was out there multiple times, but the Goose, they all jumped aboard and sent me pictures. They brought pictures over. So are there Goose pictures? Yes, there are. And the Edgars, Goose and Edgars, those are the families that participate. So it seems like it's almost, self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They keep growing and they keep spreading the word, and they themselves are maybe more interested in their family history, and some of those other families sadly will dwindle away. It's the same thing. The people in this room, your family histories will survive because you're doing it. But how many other family histories are just going to disappear? So there won't be records, because if no one is that designated person in your family, then they'll just disappear. So I think that's as true as the First Nations as it's true of all of us, right? And you all know that when you're searching genealogical history, you'll hit one line where there's some crazy person who's got it like 3 billion degrees back, and you're like, well, that part was easy. And then you get to the next one and you're going to hit a wall almost right away because no one's done any research and you have to do all the footwork, right? So I think that's what we're seeing there. And yeah, it came up. People did mention it, that they felt some families were much better represented. But I threw out the offer to everybody, right? So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was very interesting and informative.
Thank you very much.
We're all much better educated about this.
Call on Janice. Oh, I think I'm coming. Call on Janice. She's got an announcement from the Kawartha branch.
Every year, the Kawartha branch runs a bus trip to the Ontario Archives for a research day. So it's coming up April the 22nd. The bus starts out in Peterborough, and it does pick up at the Swiss Chalet on Stevenson Road, in that mall down there. Yep. About 8:30 in the morning.
Walmart?
You get to the archives about 10, they leave about 4, so you get a good amount of time to research. And they try not to book a lot of other stuff in so that they're there to help and whatever. So it's always a good trip. So the cost is $40, I believe. I forgot to bring the information. But you can also get it through the Kawartha branch webpage.
Thank you, Janice.
Was that just having buses?
Yeah. Yes.
Next, it looks like we're going to call on Sheila, who is going to give us our treasurer's report.
Is it off?
It's on. There we go. Yeah, just
as of today, for the current account, in February, we had $1,200.32 withdrawals. Deposits was $31.20, so our balance is $1,454.29. We still haven't heard anything about our membership fees from OGS, but it should be any day.
In the red at the moment, but there should be lots of money coming. We're hoping.
Hopefully.
And Dee, do you have any mail for us today?
One from the internet and one from snail mail.
She's found her way around.
We're gonna go the long way around.
That's the safest way.
Okay, the first one came in February 9th, which was after the last meeting. And it says, I'm looking for my grandfather who, after my grandmother died in 1945, abandoned his children, my mother. The family has no idea where he went. I'm casting a wide net, hoping to find a little bit more of his life after 1945. I'm looking for a Joseph Henry Taylor, usually went by Hank. Born 1895 in Claverton, Somerset, England, near Bath, or Moncton, Farley, or Farley Wick. Death date, she has no idea. Married to an Eleanor Elise King in England, 1945. Lived and worked in Port Hope, where he had his last seen. I noticed there's a Joseph H. Taylor in the Cartwright Union East Cemetery. Can you match up my grandfather that I'm looking for? Thanks. And that was from Carol Baker. And that came through the internet.
And that wasn't him in the cemetery.
It wasn't him. Well, there we go.
You didn't check that much.
Okay. The second one came in today, and it really was for Anne because it has a funeral card with it. And it's an unusual one because she has all the information. She's just letting us know about it. It's Melinda Jane Studholme, her funeral card. She was born in Muskoka. She's buried in the Uxbridge Cemetery, married to a Walter, who was a farmer. She only knew her grandfather. She didn't know her grandmother, who was Melinda Jane Studholme. She has the obituary that was in the paper. She has her funeral card. She knows all about her, and she's hoping that the information is good for us.
Excellent.
I'll have a photocopy for you and give this to Anne eventually. If you want any information, just see me at the end of the meeting. I gotta take these glasses off because everything's blurry.
Thank you,
They're for
Dee.
reading.
Okay. Okay, we'll save that one for the next time then. Yeah, it is, I guess, getting a little late. Okay, upcoming meetings, as you can see, Nancy will be talking about DNA, tools for the next steps. So that'll be on the 7th of April. And May and June are still TBA. We're working on them as we speak. Just a reminder, our DNA Special Interest Group does meet on the 3rd Wednesday of the month in the boardroom upstairs. We open at 7 p.m. and run till usually 9 o'clock or so. It can be a variety of things. Sometimes we watch a video, sometimes someone will bring in a problem, we'll work on that. Sometimes it's just question and answer, a little bit of everything. But everyone is welcome. Contact information in case you need it. The big thing is durham.ogs.on.ca for our website, and most of the other addresses will be on there. But there is a Facebook group, there's a blog, and you can contact us. Next meeting, as we said, April the 7th, Nancy will be talking about DNA tools for the next steps. Right here in the same room. And that's my spare, which I didn't use. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Safe driving home. I hope the weather's calmed down a little bit out there and we all stay dry.